in the last few months, but also in the kind of liberal left bourgeois press. A lot of nostalgia for May 68, the 40th anniversary, and the very kitsch celebration of the anniversary of these events. This is, of course, always presented in exactly the same way, no matter what the supposed political coloration of the people doing it, which is an undifferentiated collection of events, acts of resistance. These are student protests in France, the Tet Offensive, Flower Power in Britain or the United States, Black Power salute at the Olympics, and so on. Very little reference, if any, is made to what May 68 was in France as a general strike in terms of how was it run, who was involved, how were the workers involved in that struggle, where did it go, what were its aims, why did it fail. It's just like an act of resistance, not really as an attempt to take power. Some charts describe it as a revolutionary situation of sorts, but tend to put forward very little argument for why this should be the case, except that a general strike or a mass strike is stopping things working, stopping industry working, stopping infrastructure. It's stopping things happening. But why does that represent a revolutionary challenge? What is the alternative programme for society being put forward? Very little. The French general strike is different from the other events I've mentioned, which are brought up in this kitsch nostalgia. It does, in a sense, represent the entry of the masses or large sections of the working class onto the political stage. It does involve mass collective action. How indeed it might be more comparable to events such as the first miners' strike in Britain, the miners' strike in '74, which brought down the Heath government, the Portuguese Revolution, events like this, where very large numbers of workers, class-conscious workers in trade unions and under the leadership of traditional working class parties, mount large-scale and reasonably effective struggles which don't actually go anywhere. They don't ultimately change the relations of power. The organisational forms employed in these struggles are nothing new. Ideas reinvigorated on the 68 left, such as workers' councils, workers' self-management, things like this are really nothing new to what was experienced in the revolutionary struggles in Europe after World War I. So I'm going to talk through the history of the French labour movement during the 60s, and then about the way what happened during the strike, why things played out as they did. So what you have in the French labour movement in the 1960s, and indeed since World War II, is the absolute domination of the French Communist Party. The Communist Party almost completely controls the largest union federation, the CGT. Not only that it's influential or leads it, but that the union is and the party were monolithic. Very little internal opposition permitted. The union controlled by the CP. In this union, for example, Trotskyists or anarchists or syndicalists were routinely beaten up, driven off picket lines, driven away from factories. CP members would try and get their left opponents sacked, removed from their workplaces in order to maintain their control on the labour movement. I mean, the CP in electoral terms was not quite as successful as the party which later became the Parti Socialiste. But even so, sorry, in electoral terms, but even so, I mean, the Communist Party was the party of the working class. It had a massively greater membership. I mean, 368, the membership of the CP was probably 750, 800,000, whereas that of the Parti Socialiste, what became the Parti Socialiste, was about probably 60, 70,000, much more of a kind of petty bourgeois membership, doctors, lawyers, maybe teachers, whereas the CP is the party of the industrial working class. What marks the politics of the French Communist Party is a sort of left nationalism and a state capitalism, an anti-immigrant party, a party which had been French chauvinist in the Second World War, a party committed to centralisation of the means of production under the aegis of the bourgeois state. It was its culture, also in terms of things like kind of sexual liberation, national liberation, so it was very, very conservative. In the Algerian struggle for independence, the French Communist Party wanted peace. It wanted a settlement, wanted negotiation. It didn't call for victory to the FLN or even self-determination for Algeria. This played into the hands of the Gaullist state, which after the 1958 military coup in Algiers, which brought down the parliamentary Fourth Republic and initiated the Fifth Republic, had very centralised and presidential executive. So you have de Gaulle is brought to power by this coup. He's able to rule. He's able to use decrees, les ordonnances. The government has direct control over the state broadcaster ORTF, which is the only French broadcaster. There's others like Europe, number one, but so I don't mean just that the station is owned by the state, but it's under public ownership. But the government actually decides on the output of these stations, of what's on TV. So what you get is things like the news is heavily focused on international issues, problems in other countries, as very selective and very heavily censored a view of what's going on in France. Indeed, until several days into May 1968, the TV carried no reports of student demonstrations at all. And furthermore, radio weren't allowed to report live from any demonstrations at all. Also, the government has the ability to use direct state repression. So, for example, in during the Algerian War, there was an evening when Algerian people in France had been put under curfews where they weren't allowed out after 9 p.m. And there was a large demonstration in the northern suburb of Paris, and which was clamped down on the police, and they just butchered 200 people. In another demonstration in 1962, there was an attack on a CGT demonstration, and 8 people were killed. Again, the 1963 miners' strike was put to an end by a government decree saying the workers have to go back to work, no negotiations. They're just ordered to. So, in this situation of in France, the working class is in a pretty weak situation, which is hardly helped by the trade union bureaucracy, of course. You have these very diffuse and isolated struggles on particular issues, but the Communist Party has no project, it has no strategy for taking power other than electoralism or blocs with Social Democrats. So when in 1967 de Gaulle the government imposed, under Pompidou, imposed social security cuts, pay cuts in the public sector and so on, you get very lame reaction. You get one-day strikes, rolling actions, disconnected disputes of all sorts. Workers in one office go on strike, social security office go and strike on a different day to the next one, and so on. And it's just very weak. And what you do get instead of this kind of action is a certain amount of kind of wildcat actions, and particularly among young workers who are particularly vulnerable to unemployment in this period, let's say winter 67, 68. And indeed, in several cities in northern and western France, there are literally riots over pay because the unions just don't do anything. So monolithic, so bureaucratic, so conservative. In Caen, Quimper, and Le Mans, in winter 67, 68, there were large-scale riots in which there was looting of shops, pitched battles with the police in the streets, barricades. Some of the actions which we might associate with May 68. As yet, however, there is no explosion, and of course, there's kind of pent-up energy in the working class. There's a sort of diffuse kind of anger at what's going on. People want to resist. There's people want an end to attacks. People are faced with this very centralised, very authoritarian state, and indeed a reflection of that in the universities, of course, is that you have very paternalistic, authoritarian rules mixed with a technocratic education system. So hundreds of thousands of working class students coming to university who wouldn't have, say, 20 years earlier, new campuses, new buildings, new courses and so on, but at the same time, gender-segregated dorms, people not allowed to have visitors in their rooms after 8 o'clock. You see all sorts of stuff about matrons checking the sheets to check the students haven't had sex, stuff like this. Students not allowed to smoke on campus. Before the anti-smoking stuff. And indeed a ban on political activities on campus. And all of these things, particularly combined, of course, with agitation against the Vietnam War, are the source of the student struggles. And what happens with the student struggles, which I want to go into any particular detail about, is that these are faced with increasing repression to fairly shocking levels. Fairly confident student movement retaliates, and in this culminates, of course, in the famous Night of the Barricades in Paris on 10th May 68, where there 20,000 people manning 60 barricades just have a massive all-night fight with the CRS, the riot police. Although it's claimed that only 2 people died during all of the events of May and June 68, it's of course not the case. Lots of people were found dead in the woods, found dead in cars, this kind of thing. But what this demonstration, this Night of the Barricades, achieves is that, although it's successfully repressed, is that the government embarrasses itself. It shocks its supporters' opinion. It shocks the French petty bourgeoisie that they are clamping down on students like this. And so the police withdraw from the occupied Sorbonne. What does this show? That it's possible to effectively resist the government. The unions and the union bureaucracies alive to people's realisation that it is possible to fight, it is possible to resist de Gaulle, it's possible to defeat de Gaulle. Try and harness this sentiment with a strike day on 13th of May 1968, like a national one-day strike across all sectors. This is combined with large demonstrations as well. In Paris, 1 million people. In Nantes, much less known, although certainly important to the later events, there's a riot, and the students and young workers invade the police prefecture, take down the French flag, put up the red flag, and the prefect of police for the Nantes region actually calls the Ministry of the Interior in Paris and asks for permission to open fire to drive them out of the police station. The immediate effect of this is to spark a dispute already taking place at the Sud Aviation aircraft plant in Nantes, where there's already an ongoing dispute, rolling strikes over the previous month, partly thanks to the energies of a Lambertiste activist called Yvon Roqueton. And here, having seen the power of this movement, the students of One in Paris, massive demonstration and riot in Nantes, the sense of isolation is broken. There's no coherent political leadership to this dispute, but on the day after this demonstration, they occupy their factory. They take it over. They lock up the boss in his office. They hold him as a prisoner there for the subsequent 2 weeks, and they say the first factory occupation in France since 1936, the June 36 strike waves. This movement then spreads in similar places like Renault factory at Cléon, which had similarly already been in dispute. There's an occupation, and Renault has great. The workers at Renault have great kind of prestige. I think you could say in the French working class certainly at the time, in that these are the places of great disputes in the past, like 47, 36. And Renault is a nationalised car company. The workers there are well paid, militant, and this is where the movement starts to explode. It does take several days, but particularly thanks to things like rail workers going on strike, thus paralysing infrastructure, thus making it hard for people to get to work, or post and communications going on strike, so no phones, no posts. And indeed, in large areas of France, workers at power plants actually are able to effectively cut off power supplies. This paralysing infrastructure, of course, makes the strike spread. People can't work. But the one thing that never happens at any point in May '68 is any of the union leaders or any of the union leaderships declaring a general strike, not even in any particular sector or any particular industry. What they do is they run each strike on its own, separate from all of the others. I think when people think of supposedly 9 million workers occupying their factories, what they imagine is millions of workers sitting in workplaces and factories having discussions about what they're going to do. Maybe they have some illusion that these people have actually taken over their workplaces and have stolen them, as in say the Argentinian experience of 2002. Workers occupy factories, steal them off their bosses, and just run them by themselves as their own cooperatives. This doesn't happen. In fact, the Communist Party and the union leaderships, not only the CP-led union, the CGT, but also the kind of Catholic reformist union, the CFDT, are acting in a completely undemocratic, conservative and hostile attitude towards the strike. So Renault, we all hear about how the students who were in the JCR, which became the LCR, they go to the Renault factory and the guys in the door tell them to fuck off, say, yeah, we're the workers, we're in the Communist Party, who the hell are you? But what people don't talk about is the fact that also Renault workers from Billancourt go to speak to Renault workers at Cléon, and are also told, no, this is our strike. Go away. There's very, very little contact of that sort, except within far left groups, all of which are very, very small. The Trotskyist groups, which are the significant groups to the left of the CP, it's true of the Maoists as well, have hundreds of members at most. the strikes were not run in any sort of democratic fashion. There's almost no elected strike committees. In most workplaces, a handful of union officials occupy the factory by themselves and tell the workers to go home and wait until it's all over. There's not occupying a factory is only a means to an end. It's just like a more effective version of a picket line because you're stopping work taking place. But the solidity of the strike, the fact that the police aren't going to come, and so on, means, and the generalisation of the action means that they're able to pass this off as unnecessary. And indeed, of course, the meaning of telling people not to come to the occupation is, well, just wait until it's all over and we've got a deal. This is not heading anywhere. It's just a kind of normal strike which will be resolved in negotiations. And indeed, it's often said that in the general strike, the strike was betrayed by the CP or by the union leaders. But actually, they never said they were going to do anything different to what they did. They always said that they were going to negotiate a deal with the government. They always said they were going to secure a pay rise, get rid of certain anti-union laws. The CGT put out a 4-page circular to this effect on 17th of May. And this is exactly what the Brunel Accords, the agreement with the government, that's exactly what they did. There are certain cases where people talk about the idea of workers' self-management. These are largely fairly shallow. One most often mentioned is the Saclay nuclear research plant, where there's a lot of talk of workers' commissions running the plant, organising research, workers deciding on what research they're going to do, and so on. The problem being, of course, that it's a nuclear research plant owned by the government. So what are they planning to do? What can they do instead? Unless they choose to do some sort of research utterly different from working on nuclear power and nuclear facilities, and unless this working class power exists in society as a whole, they can't really achieve anything, which is why what happens, which is, of course, that the workers' commissions become advisory bodies when the strike is sold out. The workers just play a kind of part in management boards. They get a say in what research is done, but really they're just helping make sure that the work done is efficient. They're just saying, it's just like any number of the modern employee participation schemes where workers are encouraged to give kind of good ideas for what can for the direction the business should take. The same happened at the CSF telegraph plant in Brest, and the worst example of exaggeration is the so-called Nantes commune, where if you read Cliff and Birchall's book, they describe it as a Nantes commune. The situation of dual power with a workers' government. In fact, it was nothing of the sort. What you had was comité de quartier, like neighbourhood committees, which organise during the strike, during the paralysis of infrastructure. They organise things like food distribution, give out petrol vouchers, this kind of thing. And the union bureaucracy centralises this. It takes them over. It sets up a central strike committee with representatives of all the unions. This has nothing to do with dual power or working class rule in the city. It's an accounting mechanism whereby union bureaucrats take over the functions of state. Indeed, in this case, they take over the functions of state with the active collaboration of the existing local authorities and the existing local police. The leading figure in this, Alexandre Hébert, who was a in the Lambertiste group, described himself as an anarcho-syndicalist. He was the head of Force Ouvrière, the union set up by the CIA. He was the head of this union in Nantes and the local region for 40 years, until he's recently succeeded by his son. And Hébert is a Freemason, as was the head of local police. And I think that certainly has something to do with the process which takes place, which is that the unions give out petrol vouchers, they give out food vouchers, but there's no differentiation or discrimination really. I mean, they have price checks, but they just give, they're not expropriating anything or anyone. They don't open up the food distribution depots and take it themselves. They don't put any of the factories or other workplaces back to work. They don't try and run the city. They're carrying out emergency measures for the population while the strike is still ongoing, and that's why they held meetings with the local mayors, at which this was explained. Everyone was told not to panic. Indeed, if this central strike committee were so revolutionary, if it were dual power, you might have expected that the local press would have reported on its activities in the days after it was set up, but actually barely at all. So the end of the strike is when it is the struggle is moved from the terrain of factory occupation and so on to that of the negotiations and the parliamentary politicking happening at the same time. The Communist Party had long wanted to have a coalition government with the Social Democrats, the SFIO, Parti Socialiste, but François Mitterrand, who was later a Parti Socialiste president, of course, swept the rug from under their feet by staging a press conference after the agreement, the Grenelle Accords, saying that he wanted a provisional government to be headed up by Pierre Mendès-France, who was a leading figure in the Parti Socialiste Unifié, this left social democrat formation, and he suggested a provisional government also with several social democrats as ministers. In fact, Mitterrand himself wasn't in the SFIO. He was a member of a thing called the Collective of Republican Institutions, which was a very tiny and bourgeois liberal group in an alliance with the SFIO. So what this provisional government means is it has little impact on the real events. It is a blow against the Communist Party. It's saying we're not going to work with you. But in fact, the lack of seriousness of the proposal is shown by the fact that he hadn't even asked Pierre Mendès-France if he wanted to be president of a provisional government before he held a press conference saying that this should take place. So, by the way, there is talk of the kind of dangerous situation even after the Grenelle Accords. People cite things like Charles de Gaulle going to Germany to look at troops and check if they were still loyal in case he wanted to use them against the working class. But and indeed, this is allied to the view that there was mass resistance to the Grenelle Accords. Actually, this is not really the case. There was no alternative organisations. There was no significant opposition within the Communist Party or the union leaderships, except for a couple of dissidents like André Balchenet, who weren't really able to pull any forces behind them. They held this rally at the Charlety Stadium with 30,000 people, but I mean it was the far left, students, hangers-on. It wasn't organised. They had no project. There's little meaningful resistance to the sellout, and when it does, where there is, It's actually kind of quite late on into June, while the elections are going ahead, after the CP has and the CGT have called for a return to work. And the isolation of these kind of workplaces like Renault Flan and Peugeot Social means that these occupations are just smashed by the police, and they kill a couple of people in doing it. So the question is, could the working class have taken power? The answer is it didn't come particularly close. You don't have, and although large numbers of people are on strike, it's by no means the case that the situation was revolutionary. It was isolated in one country. The creeping class struggle in Italy largely came later on, and even within a French context. I mean, there's no democracy within the labour movement. There's not there's neither a mass revolutionary party nor even a sect which can really aspire to be one. And the left is very poorly implanted in the workers' movement and in industry. The fact of the matter is that without any alternative organs of power, without any group articulating a project for another type of state, with barely any examples of workers talking about or seriously considering how they might run industry, how they might run workplaces, how they might run society themselves, the situation is not revolutionary. If the working class is not in control of its own organisations, if it doesn't have the ability to control its own party, its own unions, then it cannot rule society. It has to be educated in democracy, in managing their own affairs, in managing their own movement, in order for that to be replicated in society as a whole. So therefore, I think that I would say that the dominant consensus that a general strike is necessarily a revolutionary situation or a near revolution is largely empty of content, and particularly in this case.
Okay, I usually downplay 68, but since David has been so firm in downplaying it, I will, to some extent, play it up. And my answer, just to give an answer to the question set, as it were, my answer to the question set is yes and no. And the no is essentially for the reasons that David gives. It's quite clear that there is no question of anybody thinking in terms of a revolutionary alternative at the level of the working class masses. And there is a lack of a party organisation which is projecting, in any sense, a revolutionary alternative at the level of the working class masses. I guess there's one other thing, I suppose, to add, which is the geopolitics of the situation. De Gaulle was characterised, the de Gaulle regime was characterised by the fact that it manoeuvred between the United States and NATO on the one hand, and the USSR and the Warsaw Pact on the other. It played footsie with the Soviet Union. And for that reason, actually, the United States was quite keen on getting de Gaulle out of power. And their political representatives, David has referred to the fact that Force Ouvrière was an organisation set up and funded and continued to be funded by the CIA. Their political representatives of the United States in France, in French politics, at this period and in the preceding period and the subsequent period, were people close to the Socialist Party. Yeah. So to some extent, the fact that the Gaullist base is shocked, that it gets mass media attention all over the world, etc., is about US operations, Anglo-American operations in the media sphere to drive de Gaulle out of power. Yeah, in order to try and bring France back fully into the NATO setup, and to remove the block on British entry into the European Union, which de Gaulle had been blocking, precisely because of the knowledge that Britain would, as turned out in fact to be the case, Britain, by entering into the European Union, would serve as the United States' agent in the European Union to block any closer integration of the capitalist powers which might be antagonistic or detrimental to United States interests. So in that sense, we have, at one level, we do have an episode which is not an episode in which the working class as a class is threatening to take power, but an episode in which we've got a combination of manoeuvres by various forces in which workers are brought out on strike, brought onto the streets and so on and so forth to serve as lay figures in the drama, in a political drama of someone else. What Marx characterized back in the 1850s and 1860s as the working class as a class serving as the political tail of parties of the bourgeoisie. That said, there is another side to it, and the other side to it, we have to go a little bit further back. This is I'm speaking to a considerable extent to this article in the June Weekly Worker, which is June the 5th Weekly Worker, which is about problems with far left interpretations of May 68. But the positive element of it is this, that in the 1950s and 60s, there is an absolutely dominant bourgeois ideology. And that absolutely dominant bourgeois ideology is about a whole series of sets of things. There is convergence. It's Weberian, Weber and Durkheim theories of society which remove class antagonism from the society, and which the ideology posited that there is a single form of modern society which is characterized by gradual improvement, embourgeoisement of the working class. The working class gets better off and sees its destinies as being essentially those of the middle class. And, the comfortable middle class people cease to take collective action. Ideology is becoming less important. Revolution is an illusion. Radical change of any sort is an illusion. All that ever happens is gradual change, gradualism. There is convergence between East and West towards this technocratic. The extraordinary thing is a book by David Priestland on Stalinism, published last year, which, in its critique of Marxism, which is the beginning of the book, replicates with extraordinary clarity this ideology, and similarly in relation to the Third World, to the colonial struggles, the Send the Marines, Tom Lehrer's song "Send the Marines" represents the ideology in the form of criticizing it. The overwhelming power of the United States and of the army precluded what the old revolutionary style, the old ideological struggles in the Third World. This was entirely a matter of manoeuvres between the two blocks. There was, etc. This is what the dominant worldview was before 1968. And the events of 1968 in France but also the events of 1968 of the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia and the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, in spite of the fact that the Tet Offensive, in spite of the fact that Prague Spring was defeated, in spite of the fact that the Tet Offensive was actually a military defeat, a terrible military defeat for the Viet Cong, it was an enormous political defeat for the United States, and the events of the year were a complete destruction of that ideology, precisely because however it came to happen, whatever manoeuvres were involved, whatever extent the bureaucracy, the Labour bureaucracy, was still in practical control at the end of the day, in practical control, the reformists were still in practical control, nonetheless, the whole world image, which had been the dominant world image, and actually shared, I think, probably by both the American elite and the European elites and the Soviet bureaucracy, was shattered by these events. The American plan for Vietnam was seen to be nonsense. It was the Tet, however much it was a military defeat, it showed resistance, that pacification and stabilization, which the Americans were claiming had happened, hadn't happened, and that there was still resistance. 1968, May 68, if it had just been the student demonstrations, it would have just been, more student riots. And okay, we had stuff about student riots. We had student riots against the Vietnam War in the United States, and the Grosvenor Square demonstration in this country in '67, and indeed this stuff feeds into '68. The fact that the working class masses came out in very large numbers, the fact that you had demonstrations a million strong of workers. The fact that the CGT leadership, they said they were going to negotiate. Yeah, they reached a negotiated solution, but it's rather a different ballgame. It is, in fact, a completely different ballgame from what you described in the period leading up to '68 of the stuff which we're familiar with, of one-day strikes in a single sector, rolling strikes where one workplace is on strike for a day and then another workplace is that sort of stuff. It's a different ballgame. It has an entirely different character. And what May '68 is then followed by, a year later, the creeping May in Italy. It's roughly contemporaneous. There's a big wildcat strike offensive in Germany. The defeat in place of strife by union opposition in Britain in 1969. The mass Free the Five struggles against the Industrial Relations Act in '72. The first miners' strike in '72. The '74 miners' strike isn't actually the same thing, because in the '74 miners' strike, it was clearly the case the bureaucracy was regaining control, and although the strike shut everything down, and brought down Heath's government, well, it brought down Heath's government partly because Heath was a damn fool, but it was clear in January, February '74 that an alternative was in place in the form of the restoration of the Wilson government, which was going to begin to put a lid. But in the early '70s, and then the high point of this, in a sense, the high point of this wave in Europe is the Portuguese Revolution in '74. Now, it is clear the Portuguese, you cannot not call the Portuguese Revolution in '74-'76 a revolutionary crisis. The Portuguese Revolution in '74-'76, absolutely clearly a revolutionary crisis, involves the political breakup of the armed forces. And that's something which it is unclear, we don't know, there was some of in France in '68. but not on the scale where the state is actually at risk. But so we have in this period a very general offensive of the working class, and there is also again offensive of wildcat strikes in the United States.
You missed out Japan.
I've missed out Japan. There is in that sense, there is what happens is that whatever is going on in terms of manoeuvres in France and the interplay of politics and so on, what we have is an enormously powerful global offensive of the working class around this period. And going along with that global offensive of the working class, also an offensive of the colonial revolutionary movements against the systematic imperialist regime. There is another sort of small geopolitical thing which happens in '68, which is that for the first time Soviet missiles are capable of hitting the American mainland. With the result that the Americans are slightly less enthusiastic about, Westmoreland is told he can't use nukes on North Vietnam in that period. So, my point then is, there is an immensely powerful offensive of the working class. That offensive of the working class is taking place internationally. And the power of that offensive of the working class, actually precisely the point that you make, that these very limited, in some ways very limited, or things which aren't full factory occupations, in some cases are full factory occupations, mostly are not, mostly this stuff is controlled by the bureaucracy. Nonetheless, this immensely powerful, this offensive of the working class illustrates the sheer power of the working class and the ease, in a sense, at a certain level in which, if the working class as a class, acting together, consciously organised, with a conscious political leadership with the aim of taking power, the relative ease with which the working class in the advanced capitalist countries could take power if it could overcome the political obstacles. And if it does so in the context of an international offensive of this sort, simply the sheer power of the working class as a class in the society is revealed. But also is revealed the lie, the big lie that class politics has gone away, is completely falsified. So that's all the positive on the yes side. Where am I time-wise?
We've got about 10 minutes, 12 minutes.
10 minutes left, okay. So all of that is on the yes side. The working class could have taken power, in that sense, simply in the sense that what we have in this period is an enormous international working class offensive which shatters and smashes the political economic regime which had been running since about 1948. Of course, what the bourgeoisie then does in response to that is to abandon the regime of control which it had been operating since 1948, and to turn to a new regime of control, which is the regime of control which we have now. Towards financialization, towards the increase in deliberately increasing unemployment in the capitalist countries, towards on global scale the theory of human rights and the rule of law, the counter-offensive against the Soviet Union, the rollback of the concessions which have been made both to the Soviet Union and to the bourgeois nationalist regimes, petty bourgeois nationalist regimes in the Third World. This and beginning also with the counter-offensive, that not using American troops, but using local forces for counterinsurgency, UNITA, counterinsurgency, UNITA and the FNLA in Angola, the South African military operations across the border in Mozambique, the Contras in Nicaragua, the American support for Turkish far-right, the Grey Wolves, the strategy of terror with the Brigate Rosse, the strategy of tension with the Brigate Rosse and other state instruments in Italy, and the high point, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, 1990s, or the Christian militias, the Phalange in Lebanon, the strategy, the global strategy of imperialism shifts. And the problem essentially is this about 1968. The problem is we have an image of 1968, particularly we have an image of 1968 in relation to Tet, which is taken at the end of the day from Maoism and from the sub-Maoism, which is Guevara's falsifications, Guevara's lies about the course of the Cuban Revolution. Yeah? That prolonged People's War can always defeat. Yeah? That the victory will come through anti-imperialism and surrounding the cities, that at the end of the day, the victory of the colonial revolution is the way to victory. Yeah, okay, it's the idea predates 1968, but the Tet Offensive gave it its legitimacy for the next umpteen years and up to now, and the stupidities of the Socialist Workers' Party victory to the resistance in occupied Iraq. Secondly, in relation to the revolution in Western Europe, the image was the image of l'international situationist, these posters, imagination is seizing power, and what that represented, let's put it the simple thing, the people who did the student demonstrations, who led the Night of the Barricades, their idea of what it was to be a revolutionary was to trigger action. The exemplary act of the small group or of the minority would trigger action, which would spread like wildfire and grow into the general strike. And the general strike would automatically throw up, or the mass strike would automatically throw up new forms of self-organization, strike committees, Soviets, through which the working class would bypass its existing organized leaderships, bypass its existing organizations, and the revolutionaries, whether they were anarchists or Trotskyists or Maoists, Mao spontaneists rather than. There are two kinds of Maoists, Mao-Stalinists, who are orthodox Stalinists, orthodox communists, except that they think that Beijing has the right line rather than Moscow. Yeah? Mao-Spontaneists, who are more like closer to Guevara, closer to anarchism, but they have glorified the Cultural Revolution of 1967 and so on and so forth. We meet hardly any of them nowadays. It was always the case in Europe that there were many, many, many more Mao-Spontaneists than there were Mao-Stalinists. Now, there are a few Mao-Stalinists and virtually no Mao-Spontaneists. They've become NGO activists and Greens and
old.
Yeah. But like Dave Hillman, who was Maoist in 1970, I knew he was a Maoist in 1970s Oxford, is now works for ATTAC, I think, or British ATTAC, the British, whatever the British arm of ATTAC is, Toby Tax campaign. Anyhow, the point is, all of these people, they had this common idea that to be a revolutionary as opposed to being a reformist was trying to build up permanent, solid organizations, doing education propaganda, agitation where it was possible, building trade unions, building up parties. This was all reformist stuff. Kautskian automatism, Second International Marxism, and we were to believe in the Marxism of Lukács, in History and Class Consciousness, which is a work of the communist left, not of the official leadership of the Comintern, of Korsch, of Karl Korsch, of the young Gramsci again, of the left, the communist left, yeah? And the Trotskyists also, the new left Trotskyists, yeah? Starting with the Mandelites, but also starting with Cliff's International Socialists, which in the 1960s was a new left council communist organisation, not a Trotskyist organisation. It turned into a Trotskyist organisation in the late 60s and into the early 70s through being, quote, proletarianised, and Sean McGamner was brought in to provide it with Heleite Bolshevik hardness from his time in the... Cliff tried to recruit as many people as possible from ex-WRP, ex-Healy organisation to Bolshevise the party. Anyhow, the point is, all these new left Trotskyists had this idea that what is revolutionary politics is getting masses into action. And once you get the masses into action, the problem's solved. No problem. The automatic process of being in struggle, of confronting the bourgeois state, will produce new forms of organisation, and the new forms of organisation will bypass the control of the existing bureaucracy, escape from the control of the existing bureaucracy, will overcome, one of the things the Mandelites said is, through Soviets, the masses will overcome their fear of Stalinism, because they came across, you know, that most people, it was really the case, and Hillel's made the point in previous discussions, the real problem of Marxists in the advanced capitalist countries in the 50s and 60s was that nobody actually wanted to go over to Stalinism. Yeah. They were afraid of going over to Stalinism. And the idea the Mandelites had was once they'd had the experience of the true democracy of Soviets, which would spring up automatically in the general strike, they will no longer be afraid of that Marxism will lead to Stalinism. And this, the problem with May 68 is, on the one hand, the blunt fact, at the end of the day, the PCF and the leadership of the CGT remained in control, or got back control, whatever, to whatever extent they lost control. There was not a political alternative to the practically organised mass Communist Party. That was just as much true. The Trotskyist left had a very strong tendency to represent the big strikes and struggles of the early 1970s in Britain as being wholly autonomous, in spite of the fact that they were being organised by the Communist Party and Liaison Committee for Defence of Trade Unions, in spite of the fact that CP, the old CP, was much smaller than the Labour Party. It was still the case that it had deep, solid roots in the trade union movement, and it was those deep, solid roots in the trade union movement which were helping those mobilisations to take place. And the consequence, therefore, by thinking of May 68 as an example of the way in which the working class will take power, the left has been led to think in ways which are in substance left communist, council communist, anti-partyist communist, anti-partyist left, of the anti-partyist left of the 1920s. And those ideas in their turn were not new then. They were a repetition of the ideas of the syndicalist left in the Second International, which was heavily influenced by Sorel, and you can find echoes of them in Bogdanov and the Bogdanovites and the Bolshevik Party in 1907, and this voluntarism, that the minority action triggers the mass action, and the mass action, the spontaneity of the mass action solves all problems. So that in that sense, the image, on the one hand, May 68 was a very powerful working class offensive, and it demonstrated just how strong, as part of an enormously powerful working class offensive, it demonstrated just how strong the working class is in developed capitalism. It smashed the ideology and structures of control of 1948 onwards. But the bourgeoisie just found new structures of control. But more fundamentally, it was a grand illusion. It gave the illusion that what's in the end of the day anarchism, provides a strategic solution to the working class. And in a sense, actually, that brings us back to Boris's talk, the topics of Boris's talk this morning about the social forums. Because the Battle of Seattle and what's it, June something in London earlier, and the social forums movement is another example, actually, of the illusion that anarchism has solutions. Now, that illusion, it's important to be aware of, to be clear of that. Anarcho-syndicalism and anarchism, anarcho-syndicalism, left and council communism are real trends in the workers' movement. They are not a petty bourgeois excrescence which has no significant presence in the workers' movement. They're real trends. They're a real trend which has been in existence since Bakunin's critiques of Marx and the Marxists in 1870, has varying degrees of power, has more power in some countries than in others. Britain is a country which doesn't have a particularly strong anarcho-syndicalist or council communist tradition. And the consequence, we're tempted to think it's not important and so on and so forth. There's a real tendency in the workers' movement. It resurfaces, and it resurfaced in a sense in May '68. It resurfaced again in the 1990s. And part of that is that anarcho-syndicalism, council communism has a certain strength, which is that there is a real, at the end of the day, capitalism rules through the support of the labour bureaucracy. May '68 actually is a beautiful illustration of the fact that capitalism rules through the support of the labour bureaucracy. And the anarcho-syndicalists address, and left and council communists and so on and so forth, address the problem that capitalism rules through the support of the labour bureaucracy. And there is a real danger of, in relation to, well, it's clear in relation to official communism. Official communism is a political ideology of the labour bureaucracy. And the Trotskyists, the closer the Trotskyists come to official communism, the closer they come to creating a political ideology of the labour bureaucracy. And in that sense, the anarchists and council communists are not merely an important and existing trend in the workers' movement, they're a trend which has a real legitimate place in the workers' movement. It's not even true of the idea of the spark, striking the spark that strikes the prairie fire. I think is that an American? That's an American version of it. The spark.
That's Mao.
Yes, Mao. Yeah. It's not even the case that the spark that strikes, the idea of the spark that strikes the prairie fire is wholly untrue. There was in May '68 a spark that struck a prairie fire. And the women who went out on strike on International Women's Day in February 1917 and picketed everybody else out, they were a spark that strikes the prairie fire. The Yorkshire miners who went out and picketed everybody else out in the Great Miners' Strike, they were a spark that strikes the prairie fire. So it's not the case that there is no place whatever in the workers' movement for these ideas. The problem is that it's, at the same time, it is also the case that these ideas are capable of being desperately disorganising, and that the idea that you can actually overcome, you can do without the problem of organisation, you can do without building parties, building unions, long-term propaganda, you have to have bureaucrats, even if you have to try and find some way of keeping the bastards under control, etc., etc., etc.
The guts of priests. The guts of priests.
The guts of priests, yeah. the anarchist / left and council communist view is an illusion at the end of the day. Yeah. But then it's equally the case that it's an illusion, but it those ideas have a place in the movement. They are not illegitimate outside ideas, you know. And it's necessary to engage with them. What the SWP did with globalised resistance and their various things was to just, well, in the first place, they pretended to be anarchists, and who the hell would believe that the SWP were libertarians and believers in democratic practices. You know. But equally, they tailed the anarchists. They did not engage with them, you know, and debate what's right and what's wrong in their political ideas. That is, I think, all I'm going to say. Yeah. Just to start with 2 points in response to things which people have said. Leah and Tom both raised the question of the social demands of the students, and I think I don't think that the fact that the student movement was very considerably about sexual freedom and social demands is counterposed to the fact that it was intimately connected with the struggle of the workers' movement. Yeah, partly because this was Fordism. I know that Euros talk about Fordism and post-Fordism, but there's a sense in which an awful lot of this 50s and 60s stuff was about stifling conformity and mass production and regulation down to the last T. The time and motion men, I was in on the tail end of that in Cowley. The guy who comes and says, no, you ought to lean this way because it would be quicker. Yeah. It's actually, although it presents itself as a bunch of kids who want to get laid, at one level, it's not just about a bunch of kids who want to get laid, it's also about a regime which wants to micromanage everything down to the last dot and comma of how people behave, whether it's on the shop floor or in universities and so on. Yeah, so I think that's is part of the same thing. And it's also part of the same thing, as you said, large numbers of students coming into the campuses, that it's becoming not just something which is the social elite going to university.
That's you.
That's me. Okay. Yeah. It's a change, and it is genuine, perfectly genuine change. To be honest, my impression as having been a student in the 70s and now a lecturer in the 2000s is that actually Oxford is a place which is less, Oxford University, where I was a student down here, a place which has less working class students at it now than it had in, or less obviously working class students at it now than it had in the 1970s. Yeah. So there's a generational thing. Hillel also talks about it, that there's a generational thing. There's a generation which grows up free of the Depression and the war. Yeah. And in a sense, actually, that's what the left liberals want to celebrate. Yeah. They don't particularly want to celebrate, well, partly because they don't want to celebrate the movement of the working class, but it's also just a generational thing. A hell of a lot of people are now in senior positions who were children of 68. Yeah. So you sort of find the strangest people who are sort of ex-Maoists and ex-Trots and stuff.
Treatment and the Labour Party.
Yeah, loads of people in the, well, Jack Straw.
Jack Straw.
Jack Straw is an extraordinary thing that he writes to the Guardian to tell them he's a Stalinist. I'm not a Trot, I'm a Stalinist. Okay, so that's part of the same thing. Yeah. Jerry, profound error. Even a very small revolutionary group could have made a difference if it was deeply implanted in the working class. Yeah. The Gruppi Comunisti, the GCI, the Italian organisation, the Mandelaite Fourth International, at that time was well on the left of the Mandelaite Fourth International and consisted almost exclusively of car workers, in Turin. They had a significant influence in relation to the internal battles in CGIL in Turin and so on and so forth, and they were present, but actually they wound up having a profound indirect ideological influence, but in terms of actually affecting the outcome of the events, as opposed to having an indirect ideological influence on much larger groups, Maitan and his crowd totally failed. And exactly the same is true of the small Trotskyist groups, characteristically, the RCP had a fairly substantial proletarian implantation in the 1940s. Not enough to shift the ground in the forward class movement of the period which run up to and during the 1945 Labour government. The OCI, its predecessor, the PCI, had a big presence in the Renault car strikes in the late 1940s. Not enough, however, to displace the overall power of the Communist Party. So it's a deep mistake, and this I think is the deep mistake of 1968, about 1968, and I'm going to finish with it therefore, is this profound mistake that a small group is enough. That's the real fundamental. John's made the point. The real fundamental mistake is the idea that a small group, or even SWP, a small mass party of 5,000, if it was really 5,000, I don't bloody believe, a small group is not enough. We have to set ourselves the goal of building a party of the size and implantation of the PCF, of the PCI, but with different politics, of the pre-war German pre-1914 German SPD, but with different basic politics. Internationalism, class politics, radical democracy. We have to set ourselves that goal. Okay, where we are, we're a hell of a long way from that. We can't think in terms of what we have to have is a small group which intervenes in the mass struggle, the cog which drives the little wheel, which drives the big wheel. It's a profound misconception. May 68 is actually part of the demonstration that it's a profound misconception.
Ben asked the question, kind of, what should the left have said, what should they have done, what demand should they pose? But I mean, presuming that when we say the left, our sympathies lie with small Trotskyist groups. Well, I'm not sure of that, but in terms of Marxists or kind of people who were subjectively revolutionaries, what kind of demand could they have posed? I mean, the problem is precisely that they can't do or say anything which is going to lead to some sort of revolutionary outcome. But even in terms of the more generous or fuller democracy, I mean, what can they say? Because they can't seriously pose the question of who rules, who should be in power. In fact, what the JCR did do was near the end of the strike and before the elections was to call for a workers' government, while at the same time refusing to call for a vote for the PCF or the SFIO because they'd sold out the strike. Of course, that left them nowhere because it just doesn't mean anything. I mean, what is a workers' government and who is in it? Certainly not them. I mean, they didn't even have enough members to be all the MPs. I mean, what does come out of 68 in that sense, and what is important in terms of being able to build the revolutionary alternative to the PCF, is that it does change the culture of the labour movement to quite a serious extent. Although none of the union leaderships were displaced by it, although the unions grew after the strike through people joining during it, although the Trotskyist groups were still, the non-Baptistes and JCR were both around 1,000 afterwards. Actually, the Maoist groups were significantly bigger. What did change was that the far left actually did have a kind of political voice. I mean, it was taken seriously. people like the student leaders and so on, I do mean student leaders, did during and after '68, get to be on national TV, get interviewed in the papers. They were taken seriously in a way that a group of a couple of hundred people wouldn't have. So, I mean, Alain Prévin stood in the 1969 presidential elections in France. I mean, he didn't do very well. He got 1.2%. But, compared to anything the Trotskyists could have dreamt of before, that was quite a coup. Indeed, the other thing which changed was that they were able to get themselves into the unions. They were able to take part in vaguely democratic structures in the main bodies of the labour movement, while the Lombardies persisted in what they were doing anyway, which was trying to get people high up in the bureaucracy of Force Ouvrière, because it was open for that. The far left and revolutionaries, Marxists, could get implantation, if you like, in a way they hadn't before. But I don't think there's any. I think the demands to be posed should have been in terms of democracy in the labour movement. Elected strike committees for the unions to declare a general strike, which they never did. For the unions to set up, commissions with workers from different workplaces. More elections of unions positions, these kind of things. It's about democracy in the labour movement as well as democracy in society. On the question of the ecology movement, I mean, one of the things about '68 in France, which is often kind of obscured because it's elided with other movements in other countries, is that actually the women's movement and ecology movement were both very, very weak before and during '68, and only really started afterwards. The feminist movement was set up by the MLF, was set up mainly by Maoists after '68. I'm not really sure of much in the ecology movement in France at the time, although actually in the '70s the ecology movement in Germany, which I don't know much about, but did represent for a lot of the '68 generation a shift to the right. People like Joschka Fischer, but also most prominently Daniel Cohn-Bendit, were actually, not only did they kind of, after a couple of years of anarchism and so on, they were not only in the Green Party and stood in elections with the Greens, but they were actually in the Realos, not in the Fundis. They were on the right of the German Greens. I think the reason for the nostalgia the nostalgia in the liberal and even far left press for '68, the reason it's of the coloration it is that people who were in that generation of people who are radicalised, who are now no longer radicals or revolutionaries, write about the spirit of the time and how great it was for them and how the culture and so on, but they deprive it of any sort of revolutionary content or any sort of sense of working class action, which is the reason why most people on the far left would be able to tell you a lot more about the flower power and the student movements than they could about of '68 than they could about anything like the Portuguese Revolution or the miners' strikes in Britain in the early '70s. History is deprived of its real content. Things like the mass strike, factory occupations and so on, are far less well remembered than things like the posters produced in the Atelier Populaire in Paris, because those are the documents of middle class students and artists, which are now for all to see, whereas the consciousness which existed in the strike zone can't be recreated. So, I mean, I don't dismiss May '68. I don't think it's nothing. It obviously is. It is something. It's not just the usual pre-election period or whatever. But the illusions which the left has in this as an example of a near revolution if only certain demands have been posed, if only some left group had a few more members or whatever. You know, Tony Cliff said about that. A miners demo in '92, I've only had a few thousand more people.
30,000, so.
Oh, okay. You know, those. I mean, that's really meaningless because the whole problem is that the alternative isn't posed. No positive alternative is posed in most people's consciousness, and that's not going to kind of come about through the strike. So what you have instead is demands of within the labour movement, demands for democracy, demands which enable you to do something else afterwards. But there's no prospect at any that the strike is going to just continue to escalate until you know it's going to escalate and that like action, indefinite action, is somehow going to result in a different type of society.